Balancing risk and reward is a critical component to being successful at fantasy football. Now, we don't have to go all in and take on unnecessary risk early on in our draft, but as it progresses, we have got to be willing to take shots on players that could drastically outperform their draft position. One of the best ways to do this is by identifying talent profiles that are actually very similar to early round picks, but they are in ambiguous situations. In these scenarios, fear, uncertainty, and doubt have depressed their price, but if things break their way, they could absolutely obliterate their ADP. Right now, there is one player that fits this profile perfectly, and drafters are letting him slip into round 7 and round 8 of drafts. And guess what? His downside isn't even as bad as what some might expect. In fact, it's in the same range as the players going around him. This is where the balance of risk and reward meet to provide us with some intriguing fantasy value. So the naysayers with Swift are gonna tell you the Eagles didn't even give up that much for him. They gave up a 4th round pick, which they can recoup if they decide to move on from him as a compensatory pick. They're not attached to him. They're also gonna say this is an uncertain backfield. We've got Rashad Penny and his whole $500,000. And yes, guess what? Penny's been a really good running back, so he's probably gonna be a factor. And then you've got, well, Kenneth Gainwell. He outsnapped Miles Sanders in the Super Bowl. He's going to have a role as well. Okay. And finally, Jalen Hurts. He's going to steal all the rushing touchdowns. Did you guys know that? There are going to be no other rushing touchdowns for anyone but Jalen Hurts. And he's also not going to throw to running backs because he likes to scramble. There are a lot of things that have people scared about DeAndre Swift. Look, I hear all of those concerns, but guess what? DeAndre Swift has never been in a full-time role in his career so far. And what has he done? Despite all of that, he has still finished as the RB 16, 9, and 15 in PPR. Oh, you play in a half PPR? He's been number 22, number 12, and number 16 over the last 3 seasons. And guess what? He's going 4 to 5 rounds later than the price we used to pay to get those fantasy points. So let's talk about Jalen Hurts stealing all those rushing touchdowns inside the 5-yard line. Okay, DeAndre Swift, he's never been the primary ball carrier inside the 5-yard line for the Lions. His best season was 46% 2 years ago. Last year, only 10%. Yet he still continued to produce fantasy points. How? Because he is uber talented. Swift is one of the most explosive running backs in the NFL. Carries of 10 plus yards or more on 13 and 14% of his totes over the last 2 seasons. Guess what? An RB1 profile over the last 3 years is 11.5%. Swift has been better than that. And beyond that, Swift has the target earning ability that we love, especially in PPR and half PPR formats. A 27% targets per route run last year, 24% the year before. Guess what the threshold is for being an RB1 over the last 3 years? 20%. Swift is far above that. And in fact, last year, the only running back better than DeAndre Swift was Austin Eckler at 28%. So let's take a look at the realistic range of outcomes for Swift this season. First, we'll break down the bearish view, which really takes all of the negative things we've talked about and bakes them into his projection. Then we'll take a look at his median outcome. And finally, we'll close with what if everything breaks right for DeAndre Swift in 2023. So let's start with that bearish view. We've got Swift coming in. He is stuck in a complete committee. He only gets 30% of the rushing attempts. Despite his receiving prowess, he doesn't take over the passing down role fully. We're only going to give him 45% route participation. We're going to assume that Gainwell is still going to get some of that role as well. And guess what? Despite the fact that he had a 27% target rate last year, we're going to crank it all the way down to 21% because Jalen Hurts doesn't throw to running backs, despite recent research from Sam Hoppen that shows that Hurts actually only contributed a -1% target share to his running backs. Using those percentages, we would have Swift at 135 rushing attempts, 609 rushing yards, and 4.3 rushing touchdowns. On the receiving side, that would be 34 receptions for 252 yards and another 1.6 touchdowns. That would come out to 11.1 points per game in a PPR and it would be 9.9 points per game in a half PPR setting. Guess what? Those are both below his career averages of 14.9 and 12.9. So we are really punishing Swift in this range of outcomes. And guess what? That still comes out as a mid-range to low-end RB3 over the last 11 seasons. So now let's take a look at that median projection. And guess what? We're not going to get crazy. Let's still keep this super reasonable. We're only going to bump those rushing attempts up from 30 to 35%. We're going to take route participation up from 45 to 50%. So in this projection, we're now at 158 rushing attempts, 711 rushing yards, and 5.1 rushing touchdowns. In the receiving department, this bumps us up to 42 receptions for 315 yards and 2.1 touchdowns. So what does that bring us to? 13.4 points per game in a PPR and 11.9 in a half PPR, and that is good enough for a mid-range to low-end RB2 finish that you're getting in round 7. And finally, let's discuss the high-end range of outcomes for DeAndre Swift. And guess what? He has a lot of paths to get there. We've already talked about how good of a player he is. He could just earn this role of everyone on the Eagles roster. He is the one that can give you the rushing upside and the receiving upside. He's the most complete back. But let's say it is a committee to begin the year. We've seen Rashad Penny have to battle injuries, so there are other paths to more touches for DeAndre Swift. Having said all of that, we're still going to stay reasonable here. We're going to give him 50% of the rushing attempts. Now, the best backs in the league, they get to 60, 70%, but we know that's not realistic given the fact that Jalen Hurts is still going to be involved, and we know that the other backs are going to get some carries. So we'll use that 50% number. From a route participation standpoint, we do have a little more room. We're going to bump him to 65%, and let's see what that gives us. In the rushing department, that would bring us to 226 attempts for 1,016 yards and 7 rushing touchdowns. From a receiving perspective, that would bring us to 55 receptions for 410 yards and almost 3 receiving touchdowns. When we add that all up, that is 18.3 points per game in a PPR, and it's 16.4 in a half PPR. That would be good enough for top 6 finishes at the running back position. Now I hear you. Wait a minute, Dwayne. What about Jalen Hurts? What about his role in the run game? He gets all those carries inside the 5. We've got the tush push. He's going to steal all of that work. And you're right. That is a factor. But guess what? Every Eagles running back last season finished above the 3.2% average rushing touchdowns per attempt for the league. Miles Sanders was at 4.2%. Kenneth Gainwell at 7.5%, and Boston Scott was at 5.6%. For these projections, I've kept DeAndre Swift at the league average of only 3.2%. So in summary, when we use a reasonable, and that's the key word, reasonable range of outcomes here for DeAndre Swift, there's really not a lot of downside, and there is a whole lot of upside. Even in his bearish case, he's going to put up points that should be similar to wide receivers you're taking in that range. Quentin Johnston, Jahan Dotson, both young players we love to draft, but they have their own questions. Johnston's a rookie. He's probably the 3rd option on the Chargers. And then we have Jahan Dotson, the number 2 target behind Terry McLaurin in Washington, but we don't even know who's going to be throwing him the football. But one step up from that range of outcomes, we just really get to where DeAndre Swift has been his entire career, which is a mid-range RB2, despite the fact that he doesn't have an every down role. This is a back that has overcome that obstacle throughout his career, and he now plays on an offense that's going to score a lot of points. And finally, if things do break Swift's way, and we look at his profile, his archetype, it looks much more like an Austin Eckler, more like a Christian McCaffrey, a Tony Pollard, guys that are going in the first 2 rounds because we know they can score 16 plus fantasy points per game, 20 fantasy points per game in a PPR. And guess what? DeAndre Swift has that same upside if things work out perfectly and you're getting him in round 7. That makes him a bet we want to make.